This is PD World. I am Syed Muhammad Ali and you are watching Faultlines. United States and China are not enjoying great relationship with each other. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the US, visited China between 18th and 19th of June. This was the highest level delegation sent from the United States to China during last 5 years. Not only the two sides discussed a variety of matters, but also discussed things that have been problematic between the two sides, particularly the economic cohesion from the United States to China. Importantly, Korean Peninsula has also some developing problems where United States and China are again standing against each other as arch rivals. All of this in today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest joining me from United States is Peterson. Cole is an independent analyst. He writes frequently for Militant Wire Network. Cole, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Syed. I appreciate being on your show again.
Cole, what was the background of this visit of Secretary of State who was in Beijing for the first time in the last 2.5 years? We believe this to be one of the top visits from the US side.
Well, that's a very interesting question. You see, the visit was first scheduled for February of this year, but it did not happen at that time because the Chinese spy balloon that was shot down after traversing the U.S. Over some of the most sensitive military sites in the country. Furthermore, many domestic audiences in the U.S. see the Biden administration as having been a little desperate to have this meeting. This includes former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who said that the visit made the U.S. look, quote, weak and acquiescent. Blinken was able to meet with Wang Yi, Qin Gang, and Xi Jinping while in China, with the meeting with Xi being sort of last minute and unexpected initially. This meeting in part was part of the Biden administration's attempt to try and cool tensions in the Western Pacific, primarily around the issue of Taiwan, but also the larger security situation in the Indo-Pacific region. Fortunately, both China and the U.S. did agree to work towards stabilizing relations between the two countries. However, there are still some major sticking points between the U.S. and China before real progress can be made. And these sort of sticking points include sanctions that have been placed on top Chinese government officials by the U.S. government, and most notably, this includes Defense Minister Li Shangfu.
And right after this visit, there was a statement, I would say a harsh statement, given by President Joe Biden with regards to the Chinese president. Do you believe there was a reason for making such a statement after this long-awaited visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, his statements were sort of very unexpected and maybe a little odd. Biden called Xi Jinping a, quote, dictator during a Democratic Party fundraiser event in California. Calling someone a dictator can likely be seen as a little insulting. However, this sort of comment didn't really mash up with what President Biden said otherwise, which included Biden saying that he thought relations between the U.S. and China were on the right path. Biden's comments also seem to be a little bit out of line with the general track that the U.S. seems to be trying to take with China, which is to de-escalate tensions. Such off-the-cuff comments by Biden run the risk of washing away the meager amount of progress that has been made by Blinken's visit. And there's also the very strong possibility that Biden's comment there was potentially the result of his cognitive decline that seems to be readily apparent as time goes on.
And right after this visit, there was a visit by Narendra Modi, India's premier, to Washington, D.C., wherein there were few agreements that have been signed between the United States and India, which will make China certainly further uncomfortable. Do you believe this was the right timing for extending such a red carpet for Indian side?
Yes, absolutely. While Secretary of State Blinken was in China, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was visiting the U.S., where, among other things, he gave a speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress. Some notable agreements that were reached between India and the U.S. during Modi's visit included the allowing the American company General Electric to produce jet engines in India in cooperation with the Indian company Hindustan Aeronautics. These jet engines would be used in Indian military aircraft. But also notably, there was the maritime agreement that would enable U.S. Navy ships in the region to stop in Indian shipyards for repairs. While both Indians and Americans stayed away from specifically naming China as the cause of their increased cooperation, China is clearly the focus of the relationship between India and the U.S., certainly the increasing ties between India and the U.S. And China recognizes this, and it sees increased cooperation among the Indian and U.S. governments as potentially, squarely aimed at China, viewed by those two governments as a potential threat.
So if I understand you correctly, not only the timing was not correct, but China is being deliberately displeased by the United States with all these developments.
Yeah, certainly I think American foreign policy is usually not that complex of a game. I think generally that American actions can be explained by three things. One, as planned and determined policy, as it's sort of intentionally planned. Two, issues that arise domestically, politically, as different American political factions attempt to impact policy in the way it's executed. In addition to that, going back to my earlier question, there's also the potential issue of President Biden's cognitive decline. So I think ultimately a lot of American policy aims and objectives aren't necessarily sort of aimed at creating complex issues or a complex game to be played at. I think it has much more to do with maybe inconsistency among the U.S. government in trying to execute this policy that's already been planned.
And what exactly is happening in Korean Peninsula? We have learned that North Korea and South Korea both have again become a hot point, a hot spot, a bone of contention between the two sides. What exactly is happening in Korean Peninsula at this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at North and South Korean issues within the wider lens of relations in East Asia, you sort of have to look at a few things. First, since 2017, an American military terminal high altitude area defense system, or THAAD system, has been operational in South Korea. This system is in South Korea at the request of the South Korean government over concerns around North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles programs. However, this system was never fully operational because of concerns that were raised by local South Korean residents living near the site this system was initially installed. As a result, the previous administration in Korea decided to sort of pause the full installation pending a full review of local concerns. Recently, the South Korean government has determined that full installation of the system can go ahead, and that's what's happening. The system is expected to be fully online sometime next year. China, however, is particularly concerned with this system, largely because of the very powerful radar that can see well past North Korean territory into northeastern China. And because of this, the Chinese government is very unhappy with the installation of the THAAD system and views its installation and complete installation as a further escalation of tensions in the Northeast Asia region.
Carl, help me to understand the United States' stance on the issue of Taiwan. Because contrary to what the United States is doing, it officially is still of the view of one China policy that would certainly not allow any other country, including United States, to make progress with Taiwan isolating Chinese leadership. So what exactly is the point of view in the United States with regards to Taiwan? Do you not see a confusion in that?
Yes, since the Shanghai Communique of 1972, the United States has acknowledged that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The trouble for the US is that in 1979, the US government switched its recognition of the official government of China from the Republic of China, the government that is now in control of Taiwan, to the People's Republic of China, the government that is now in control of the rest of China. The government of the People's Republic of China sees Taiwan as a province in rebellion, and any U.S. support that is given to that province is seen as interfering in the internal affairs of China. Ultimately, the Chinese government wants the U.S. to cease its military support of Taiwan, which is unlikely to happen as the U.S. is bound by law through the Taiwan Relations Act to provide military aid to Taiwan. Furthermore, there are a number of political actors in the U.S., a number of congresspeople and senators who have provide strong backing to Taiwan, both through their actions and through their rhetoric.
And the shoring up of alliances against China would also be a major concern for the Chinese side, particularly when we talk about India and other alliances that are being made, other regional security arrangements that are being made. Don't you think this is all complicating the situation further between the US and China?
You know, there are certainly a number of things happening in the Western Pacific and East Asia that could give the Chinese government a reason to view American actions with concern. This has to do with a web of American military alliances and political alliances that cover a number of countries. I'll cover just a few of them. I'll start with the Philippines. Certainly, the United States and the Philippines have a long history together. Currently, under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the U.S. can base troops in the Philippines on a rotational basis, though not on a permanent basis. Historically, there have been 5 bases that the U.S. has been able to use under this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. However, back in February, an additional 5 bases were added to the pre-existing 5 that the U.S. can now use under the agreement, coming to a total of 10 bases that can be used under this agreement. China views this expansion of U.S. basing rights in the Philippines as a potential preparation for war in the South China Sea. And, you know, with an increase in American logistics capacity that these 5 bases provide, there's a legitimate reason for the Chinese to potentially see this expansion of bases that way. Furthermore, going back to Taiwan, back in April, the United States sent around 200 troops to Taiwan to provide military training to the Taiwanese military. This was a steep increase from the 30 that had been previously stationed there. These U.S. troops have been providing the Taiwanese forces, military forces, with training on U.S. weapon systems and American military maneuvers as a way to potentially counter a Chinese attack on the island of Taiwan. Additionally, if you go back to South Korea, I mentioned earlier the installation of the THAAD system, the full installation of the system. And, you know, in addition to that, you also have to look at the American military bases in Japan. The United States military has, for a long time, had a significant military presence in Japan. The U.S. 7th Fleet, a large Navy contingent, is stationed permanently in Japan, as well as a large U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Army presence on the island of Okinawa, which is relatively close, comparatively, to Taiwan. So altogether, these sort of alliances and military assistance agreements can sort of stack up to look rather threatening to non-American aligned actors in the Western Pacific and East Asia. So whether or not the U.S. is intentionally trying to alarm China, I think it's also quite arguable that China has a relatively good reason to be alarmed with all of the extra U.S. military presence there.
Thank you very much, Carl Peterson, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Carl Peterson, and as you have just heard, he has his own point of view with regards to the arrangement between the two countries, and he agrees with us on the fact that the diplomatic relationship between the two sides is quite complicated at the moment. It's not clearly headed in one trajectory. Now, coming to the second topic of our program is the development between Wagner Group and the government of Russia. Wagners that are one of the key role players in the war against Ukraine went on a mutiny against the government of Russia. They started marching toward Moscow, and all of a sudden they turned their back toward Moscow, went and joined back their positions in Ukraine, while their leader went on asylum to Belarus. Why would this happen at this time when it looked quite clear that that the Wagners are in a very strong position to negotiate whatever they wanted to, because primarily Russian military did not had a defense except for the city of Moscow, where they were making some arrangements to defend against 25,000 Wagners who are marching toward the capital. What has happened is further complicating due to the fact that Alexander Lukashenko, who is the president of Belarus, is the one who has apparently brokered a deal between the Wagners and Putin. And Lukashenko never appeared to have such a critical mass with regards to his political standing. It was never on the cards.
The world watched an unprecedented turn of events in Russia as an armed mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group challenged top Russian military brass. Feudal Wagner Group owner is seen as the biggest threat Russian President Vladimir Putin has faced to his 22-year rule. Wagner mercenary boss has demanded that top Russian military brass officials be handed over to him so that he could restore justice. The Kremlin said the question of personnel changes was a sole prerogative of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Mutinous Russian mercenary fighters from the Wagner Group were making their way to the capital before their leader ordered their return to base to avoid bloodshed. The leader of the Wagner mercenary group is leaving Russia for Belarus after striking a deal with President Vladimir Putin to end the mutiny. Under the agreement, both Wagner commander and his fighters will be spared prosecution, and the troops have been instructed to return to their bases. Russian Defense Minister has visited Russian troops in Ukraine, his first public appearance since the weekend mutiny by the Wagner Group. Wagner Group rose to prominence after taking an increasingly visible role in the war in Ukraine, including hoisting the Russian flag in the city of Bakhmut after a month-long battle. The crisis appears to have been averted for now, but what happens next for Russia and the Wagner Group remains uncertain.
So in order to discuss all of this in today's show, we have invited Preston Stewart from the United States. Preston is an independent research analyst. He's an expert of Russian affairs. He is also affiliated with Militant Wire Network, and he runs a major YouTube channel that keeps updating the viewers about the issues with regards to Russia and Ukraine. Preston, I welcome you to the show. First things first, what exactly has happened with Wagners? People who thought Moscow is falling have seen Wagners running back to their bases. So what has happened exactly there in Moscow?
What has happened, people thought Moscow was falling and Wagner leaving the ground without a battle. So over the weekend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, kicked off what now looks like it was some sort of mutiny against the Russian Ministry of Defense. So a few months back, the Ministry of Defense put out a decree that would pull all of these private military companies under their control, which was bad news for Prigozhin. This is his deal. This is where he makes a lot of money, where he has a lot of influence, and it would have significantly decreased the power that he has. And what it looks more and more like now is that this march across Russia that really didn't see any resistance from the Russian state security apparatus was not necessarily Prigozhin trying to overthrow Putin and take over the country, but to be heard and to get his complaints voiced to Putin directly, who he was having a hard time getting in touch with, had no contact with, it appears. So eventually Prigozhin and the Wagner Group took over the city of Rostov pretty peacefully, not a shot fired. There were 7 to 8 Russian helicopters shot down by Wagner forces as they advanced towards Moscow. But again, no tanks on the roads, no Russian troops coming out. And eventually the Wagner forces, the numbers there were mixed. At one point I heard there were around 40 vehicles, which would put the total Wagner forces in the few hundreds, maybe 300 to 500. Around that same time, Reuters came out and said that there was a 5,000-man Wagner force advancing towards Moscow. And it looked like something big was about to happen. And then they stopped. And news came out that Belarusian President Lukashenko brokered a deal between Putin and Prigozhin. Now, the details of that are still not totally clear. It sounds like all charges against Prigozhin were dropped, or at least that was the initial statement. They very well might still be ongoing, that he would be relocated to Belarus from Russia. Wagner troops would not be charged for their participation in the uprising, and any Wagner troops that did not take part would be absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. That was sort of the end. Everybody kind of stood down from there.
And the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, came up with a very surprising role which nobody had expected. Do you think actually he was so resourceful, or he had such a close ties with Wagner Group that he could broker this deal?
Belarusian president brokered agreement, may be exaggerated, but it strengthens his hand in relations with Vladimir Putin. Yeah, Lukashenko stepping in here was kind of unexpected. There's a lot of different ways that Prigozhin could have reached Putin, and it sounds like there's mixed reporting here, so take it with a grain of salt. It sounds like Prigozhin tried to get a hold of Putin, and he couldn't. And then at some point, Putin tried to get a hold of Prigozhin, and he couldn't. But there's also reports coming out of the Kremlin that Putin had no desire to speak directly with Prigozhin, which kind of sounds crazy at this point when there's an armed convoy moving across your country. It seems like that's the time to pick up the phone and actually have that conversation. But yeah, out of nowhere, Lukashenko stepped in and was this peace broker of sorts between Russia and the Wagner Group. It bolsters Lukashenko's reputation in the region, certainly. For a long time, he's kind of been looked at as, almost a puppet of Putin, that he really does whatever it is that Putin says, which there's been some pushback against that since the war kicked off. It seemed like for a while Putin was trying to pressure Belarus into joining the war on their behalf, and they haven't. Belarus has not committed any troops. But this was, overall a positive for Lukashenko. He really kind of emerged the hero here.
So amid all of this, what do you believe would be the future of Wagner Group? Because they are exchanged on they are occupied on so many fronts. They are utilized on so many fronts by the Russian side. What do you believe would be the future of Wagner's?
The future of Wagner's kind of unclear right now. So since this war kicked off, the majority of the focus on the Wagner Group has been around their operations in Ukraine. But long before this, they were operating in the Middle East and Africa, where they still are today. And that's been one of the big questions, is when this decree came out that all private military companies would be absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. It was not, the biggest concern wasn't really this fighting force in Ukraine, because you can see how they get absorbed into different units already on the front. But what about the groups doing, the Russian version of peacekeeping or stability operations, which the more cynical voice would say upholding some dangerous regimes or helping plot against coup attempts in Africa? What about those groups? They still seem to be operating. They don't seem to have been affected during this mutiny or coup attempt. There was a note recently coming out of Russia that the overseas operations, we'll call them that, of Wagner will continue under the purview of the Russian Ministry of Defense. But for now, the largest group of Wagner fighters, those operating in and around Ukraine, it looks like they will be absorbed into regular Russian army units.
Preston, do you believe it's going to affect Ukraine's war further? Because they had a very key role. The Wagners had a key role on various fronts of Ukraine. So do you believe it's going to affect the position of Russian military in the battlefield?
So there's a good article put out in the Wall Street Journal the night this all came. So there's a good article put out in the Wall Street Journal talking about how everybody on the Russian side lost here. That Putin looked weak, that Prigozhin looked weak, that the overall Russian state in their response to this attempted mutiny looked weak. So what they were getting at was Putin came out about halfway through this whole ordeal and gave a speech to the nation where he called this a mutiny, rebellion, that everybody taking part would be held to account. And then you fast forward a few hours later, and he's pardoning everyone. Like it didn't happen. They're sweeping it under the rug. It's hard to view that as a position of strength for Putin. I understand some folks are taking the stance that, he did a good job of making sure that no additional blood was spilled. Remember, 13, 14 on or about Russian pilots were killed, or aircraft operators, not just pilots, were killed by Wagner fighters during this whole event. So it wasn't a bloodless mutiny, not by a long shot. And then Prigozhin, who knows what happened there? The guy that had all of this power, kind of had the momentum building behind him, got really close to Moscow, and then all of a sudden just stopped and accepted this deal that it's not clear quite yet what he got out of it. It looks like he bent for whatever reason, but overall, it makes Russia look weak, like they're losing control of some of the forces within their country.
And how will it engage, how will it affect Russia's military's engagement in many other parts of the world? That includes perhaps the Syrian front or their engagements in Libya, because primarily they were quite dependent on Wagners for all of these developments.
So right now, the Ministry of Defense has put out that Wagner forces around the world will continue to operate as they have with the blessings of the Russian Ministry of Defense. That's kind of been a part, not well reported on throughout this whole little mutiny deal. The Wagner is not just this group in Ukraine and not just the group in Rostov and now potentially in Belarus, but they do have, assignments and operations going on all around the world. It doesn't look like those were affected at all. But based off of the relatively recent, I think it was just a month or so ago, Ministry of Defense decree that private military companies would come under their purview, it looks like that is still on track to happen.
Importantly, how long do you believe Prigozhin, who is the head of Wagner Group, can survive in Belarus? Apparently, he's an absconder. He is wanted in Moscow, and Putin must be looking for him. So how long do you believe he can stay safe in Belarus?
This is a big question. There's not a lot of people in Russian history or history in general that attempt, large mutinies, armed revolts, or coups and live and go free. So as of now, there really hasn't been anything heard from Prigozhin since he accepted this deal. And there's, of course, a lot of rumors and speculation that it's just a matter of time until he, unexpectedly falls out of a window or is poisoned or ends up in jail. It's kind of a mixed bag coming out of Russia at this point. There are factions calling for that, saying this is unacceptable, that Russia can't afford to let the leader of an armed revolt essentially go free, and that it, decreases the legitimacy of the Russian state. What's not clear right now is how much popular support, not just Prigozhin, but kind of what he stood for in a way, and I'll come back to that, is perceived across the Russian population. So should he be imprisoned? And by the way, it sounds like the investigation that was dropped as part of this, deal with Putin is ongoing. That came out overnight, that the investigation did not end. They're still looking into Prigozhin. But we don't know the level of popular support across the country and how many people kind of agree with this image of Prigozhin that he's presented, that he's somebody who cares for the troops more than the Ministry of Defense. And he's the person who will tell them the truth about what's happening on the front lines and the status of the war and the progress of the front. Whether or not that's true, that's kind of the image he's tried to cultivate. And you can see how that might resonate with people who have maybe grown a little, tired of the same Russian narrative, how this war is going to be over, relatively soon. And it's nothing but success and there's victory at every turn. Yet they continue to fight here, 15, 16 months into the conflict. So, Prigozhin's nowhere near the level of support that Putin has, but it's not clear if he were to be imprisoned or, accidentally killed, we'll say, what ripple effect that would have across the country.
As you covered the war strategy as well, Preston, you are an expert of the subject. Do you believe this is going to affect Russia's strategy in the battlefield?
So as of now, it looks like the answer, at least in the short term, is no. Just all of this happened and ended way too fast. So Russian forces were not occupying frontline positions anywhere on the front. So it's possible they were being used as some sort of reserve force. They could plug gaps if Ukraine made a breakthrough somewhere. But they're moving from these rear camps into Russia and then wherever they go from there, whether it's Belarus or back to other units. It's not impacting the status of the fight at the front, where the fighting is actually happening. At the same time, it doesn't look like this went on long enough for Russia to have to pull any resources from the Ukrainian theater to stop the Wagner forces or put up roadblocks or engage in battle with this rogue group. So as it sits now, it doesn't look like there was very much immediate impact as to how this war is being executed.
And lastly, have Ukraine been able to benefit out of the vacuum that was partially created with Wagners turning their back toward the battlefront?
Again, as of right now, there wasn't a lot to exploit on the battlefield. There's a lot of chaos going on inside of Russia, but it doesn't look like that rippled all the way down to the battalion and company commanders at the front. Ukraine did not stop their offensive operations over the last 72 hours. They continue to push. They made gains in 3 or 4 different areas, including a possible bridgehead across the Dnieper north of Kherson, or just barely north of Kherson. None of that seems like it was in direct response or necessarily taking advantage of this situation in Russia. Just looking back over the last few weeks, it's kind of been it flows with what they've been doing for a while now. Now, long term, something to keep an eye on is how this whole Wagner movement pushing into Russia is going to be perceived at the lower ranks of the Russian military, as well as if any changes are made at the top levels of the Russian Ministry of Defense. One of Prigozhin's big arguments is not, he's pro-war. He wants this war to continue going. He wants Russia to win this war. He just thinks they're going about it in a really poor fashion. So if some of Prigozhin's demands, or what we think are probably his demands, are met, it could mean a change in Ministry of Defense leadership, which could translate to changes as to how the Russian forces are actually executing this war.
Thank you very much, Preston Stewart, for being guest in our show.
Appreciate your patience here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the last segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, Narendra Modi's visit to the United States has caught attention of many. Many commentators are quite surprised of the fact that the United States, which has remained silent on the gross human rights violations in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, who have stayed silent on all the atrocities extended or unfolded against the minority in the Hindutva regime of Narendra Modi, particularly the onslaught against the Muslims, as well as the persecution of Sikhs who are now demanding for a separate homeland within India. United States was behaving differently. Not only red carpet was extended for Narendra Modi, but also many agreements have been signed between the two sides, which is going to further destabilize the military balance of the region. India not only is a major ally of the United States in this region, but also this is a fact that its security apparatus has been beefed up further to counter China, as we can see from the glimpse of the agreements that have been signed between the two sides. Pakistan have remained quite disturbed with the developments, particularly with the joint statement that has been issued between the two sides. And by the two sides, I mean in India and the United States. Foreign Office not only has given a diplomatic response to it, but have also summoned the Deputy Head of Mission of United States in Islamabad to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to record their protest. To talk about this in today's program, I have invited a guest, but before the guest comes, Team Faultlines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my last guest to this part of my program.
India's rising tide of Hindu nationalism is an affront to democratic ideals and civil liberties. Activists, journalists, lawyers, writers, teachers, or artists, anyone who criticizes the Hindutva government or its divisive ideology is at risk of being targeted. Amid deteriorating democracy at home, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has kicked off a controversial visit to the United States. The US President has been under pressure from activists and the Democratic Party's progressive lawmakers who urged him to publicly raise the issue of human rights in India. India. 75 Democratic lawmakers have urged US President Joe Biden to raise areas of concern on Democratic backsliding with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi during his state visit. The letter sent to the White House said that there have been independent, credible reports that reflect troubling signs in India towards the shrinking of political space, the rise of religious intolerance, the targeting of civil society organizations and journalists, and growing restrictions on press freedoms and internet access. Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat congresswoman, stated that it's shameful that Modi has given a platform at our nation's capital. His long history of human rights abuses, anti-democratic actions, targeting Muslims and religious minorities, and censoring journalists is unacceptable. India's interpretation of its own interests driven by Hindutva doctrine are not aligned with Western interests, so New Delhi is an unreliable partner of democratic world.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Syed Muhammad Ali, who's joining me from Islamabad on Skype. Ali, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Ali, your comments on the joint statement issued by the two sides, United States and India, which has strongly condemned the cross-border terrorism. And please also help us to understand which cross-border terrorism are Indians talking about, because it is rather Pakistan that is facing the problems of cross-border terrorism. It's not India, even if we go with the statistics.
Indeed, I agree with you, Shawahad, because the cause of such an irresponsible statement is primarily the growing Indian influence in the US, that US believes that in order to use India in the containment of China project and also build closer economic ties, it needs to give more space to the Indian anti-Pakistan rhetoric, which is tragic and very unfortunate, and also somewhat undiplomatic as well. But I think there's a method to the madness, and although I'm disappointed, but I'm not shocked, because India has been trying for the last 20 years to blame Pakistan for its inability to manage its own relations with its minorities, with Kashmiris and others, and also present Pakistan internationally as a concern for the international peace and security. So I see it as a continuation of Indian effort, which really, which did receive adequate response from our Foreign Office. And I think our Defense Minister and Foreign Minister also responded to it. However, this is a political rhetoric which both US current administration, Biden administration, and the Modi administration need to consider in the context of their domestic politics and also upcoming elections, because Mr. Biden also will be going for elections soon. And Modi's visit to the US is seen by the Biden administration as offering more jobs in America and more investment and trade and more opportunities for the US economy, which is trying to recover itself after a huge damage it suffered after the COVID crisis. Similarly, Modi administration wants to achieve three objectives from this US visit. First, at the domestic level, again, it wants to present itself as a leader who's bringing greater interest, attraction, and investment from the US successfully to improve the job prospects and economic investment to get more votes in the upcoming elections. Secondly, this rhetoric that you mentioned, particularly in the context of the joint statement, paragraph 32, against Pakistan, is again aimed at domestic audience and trying to convince them that India enjoys adequate influence over US to sort of blame Pakistan for things, including which are not realistic. And thirdly, India also wants to use this red carpet welcome to present itself that it is emerging on the world stage, so it should be respected and acknowledged in that way.
But Ali, again, which militant elements are they actually talking about? We have not seen any major terrorism events or militant attacks in India in last quite some years. So what are exactly the concerns that this statement was essentially trying to address, as it apparently looks more of a gimmickry of diplomatic words?
I think, objectively speaking, Shabahat, when you look at the internal situation of India, all is not hunky-dory. And despite its economic growth, I think India does face several insurgent movements, independence movements, and efforts aimed at, getting your rights of different communities. What is going on with the Christians, what is going on with the Dalits and lower caste Hindus, what is going on with the Sikhs, I think is adequately covered by the international community, and not to mention the particular case of the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But I also want to draw attention of your viewers towards the fact that, notwithstanding Biden administration's interest in presenting Modi's visit as a job fair for the US people, I think there is a considerable amount of concern at the neglect of the Biden administration about a very deteriorating and poor human rights situation inside India while dealing with the Modi administration. And I think when you look at the leading, US statesmen, think tanks, experts, media, you see hardly any outlet of media, think tank, or including the US Congress, have not, presented and considered Modi's visit as an opportunity for the Biden administration to remind India of its responsibility and commitment in its own interest to behave more responsibly and carefully towards the minorities. I think most importantly, the former US President Obama, reminded Mr. Modi that its future, the future of India, essentially depends upon how it treats its minorities. I think that's a very valid concern raised by the former US president. And I think some of the leading US think tank experts like Daniel Markey also stressed the need for the Biden administration to remind Modi administration to improve its human rights record. Leading US media outlets like New York Times, Washington Post, and several others also believe that it's necessary for the Biden administration that in its pursuit for closer economic and security cooperation, it should not neglect that the value system of the two countries are not identical, despite democratic dispensation, and the human rights record of India definitely deserves a greater concern of the international community.
And how concerned are you as an expert with regards to the planned transfer of technology that is taking place, which is going to further disbalance the security situation of the subcontinent?
I think the defense cooperation between US and India needs to be understood in three contexts. First is the economic context. Obviously, you are aware that India is the world's largest importer of defense equipment. So definitely at a time of shifting alliances, the US large defense industry considers India as a lucrative market. So that's the economic angle. And secondly comes the US national security strategy, in which it believes, notwithstanding the defense posture, but the containment of China essentially will depend upon US successfully containing the global supply chain of China and isolating it from the rest of the world. So in that context, the growing interdependence and interoperability of India and US forces and industry should be seen in that context. that India wants to increase, US wants to increase Indian defense dependence on the US industry to also ensure that it does not, enjoy too much strategic autonomy. However, I think it's very important for Pakistan to continue to remind our friends in the US that they should not overestimate the Indian security commitment in the containment of China project. Leading Indian thinkers and strategic analysts continue to remind Modi administration that the Indian core and overarching interests are to emerge as a global power and preserve its strategic autonomy, and becoming too dependent on the US will undermine India's own interests. But lastly, most important point for your viewers is to recognize that India is carefully balancing its economic relations with China and with the US. Only last year, the bilateral trade between US and India was around $119 billion, whereas the bilateral trade between India and China was $115 billion. So I think this is the ultimate evidence for the US administration that when they expect India to reduce its relationship with China only as a container, as a net security provider, I think is not translating into a proportionate reduction in the economic domain, because India also views China as a lucrative market and a major investor. So I think the bottom line is, despite US expectations that India will, serve as the main pivot of the Indo-Pacific strategy in the containment of China project, India is not willing. It is only using the US access to technology for its own rise and the diplomatic support for its for hiding its human rights record and building its military-industrial complex. But it is definitely not committed to the US interest in its own interest, either to reduce its strategic autonomy or to provoke China too much beyond what is in India's own interest.
And as you have said, Ali, yourself, it is more to create problems for China. It is more to contain China, as you have rightly pointed out. How concerned do you believe China will be with all these developments?
I think from a Chinese perspective, China is not as concerned about the defense and military rise of India as it is concerned about the US attempts to contain and constrain its geo-economic rise. So what is most important item in the thinking, in the minds of the Chinese leadership is that their rise and emergence depends upon its regional connectivity, its Belt and Road Initiative, its BRI project, its Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, BRICS, and so many other forums through which China can gradually reduce the US dominance in economic, political, and industrial processes. And China can have the space to emerge and sustain its rise. And I don't think India is adequately supporting US interest in that context. Because as I earlier pointed out, I'm sure US must not neglect the fact that the bilateral trade of India and China is almost identical at the identical level as the US-India bilateral trade. So that means and proves that India is definitely not willing to advance US interest of containing China economically, and to expect India to provoke China militarily while it continues to expand its favorable and profitable economic interdependence with Beijing. I think these two things do not add up.
Thank you very much, Muhammad Ali, for being guest in our program.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, the developments between India and the United States are a point of concern not only for Pakistan but for all other nations of South Asia. It is now to be seen how the other countries in the region respond to these developments. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.